All right, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites, we have a show for you today. I'm going to get right to introducing our guest because I'm such a fan of his, and we have a lot to talk about for the next 60 minutes or so. Philippe Fournier is here. I'm sure a good lot of you know who Philippe is and have read his work and analysis, but for our listeners who haven't, Philippe is the creator of 338 Canada, the statistical model of electoral projection based on historical trends, opinion polls, and demographic data. He deconstructs and analyzes Canadian politics with the eyes of a scientist. Not at all shocking, because by day, Philippe teaches astrophysics at Cégep de Saint-Laurent. Cégep de Saint-Laurent. So today, and this is despite my own deep knowledge of astrophysics, we're going to geek out about polling and electoral data and politics. We'll talk about the federal race, what the different voter coalitions are, what it makes the Liberal vote so damn efficient. We'll talk about Poilievre and the kind of coalition he's trying to build, where he needs his votes to come from in order to be PM. And then we'll talk about Singh and the NDP and what impact this accord with the Liberals is having on their support. And finally, we'll chat about the outlook for the upcoming Quebec election. So that's a lot to cover. Philippe, I respect the hell out of your work, and I'm so excited you're joining us here on the Herle Burly. Thanks for coming.
Bonjour, David. Thanks for having me. Very much appreciated.
So how are you? Where are you?
I'm in Montreal, in my home. I'm on vacation right now. The Cégep is starting in a month. And so, of course, everything should go smoothly with COVID cases going up again. And we have an election. So obviously, the government will not want to piss off the electorate here. So, this will be a very interesting time in Quebec in the next month.
Unlikely to be another curfew.
Oh, well, the second curfew was one too many for many Quebecers. I will talk about the Quebec numbers, but there was a distinct shift in the polling numbers in January when Legault struck the second curfew. So we'll talk about that later, I'm sure.
Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, how did you get interested in politics?
Well, I've always been very interested in politics. It's just that I was not any good at it, and I just turned out
well,
I was good.
That includes thousands of us, Philippe.
I was primarily focused in math and physics and astrophysics during my college degrees. And when I became a teacher, I was very lucky to become a Cégep teacher early on. I was only 24. I continued to study, and I did some political science at Concordia University in Montreal. And this passion stayed. But I don't want to sound cynical, but I don't really like many politicians. I don't put them in the same basket. But the science of polling and the science of elections really interested me. And I started in a 2016 American presidential election, Trump versus Clinton, where I had a humble spreadsheet compiling the polls in the swing states. And my numbers showed that Trump win was entirely plausible. And yet the pundits south of the border were almost unanimous in saying, no, it's never going to happen. And so after that happened, I figured, you know what, we need more of scientists in Canada, because when I read a newspaper article about a poll, sometimes the journalists, they're really good at what they do, but they don't do math much. And so I figured it would help the discourse to have more of a scientist's eye to deconstruct polling.
Interesting. Hey, have you ever discussed astrophysics with Prime Minister Trudeau, or does he only know quantum physics?
No, I've never done that.
I see.
It's a good question, though. It would be fun. It would be fun, but yeah.
So you aggregate all the polls. You don't do your own polling. You're an aggregator.
That's right.
And so you take all the polls and just average them?
Well, there's some modeling involved. Of course, I look at the past performances of each pollster. I look at the trends, the demographic movement using StatCan. So there is an average, but it's not a simple average. There's some, of course, modeling in there. And also, I use local polls that I get my hands on when I can get my hands on them. I talk to many political parties, and sometimes they leak their own polls, and so I will use them if I judge them to be of any value. So I do not publish all the data that I'm privy to, because that's the deal that I have with many political parties. Right. But I try to gather. I'm a gatherer of information. Try to gather the local information to have a projection that is as accurate as possible.
So how do you deal with the problem of garbage in, garbage out, in the sense that somebody may have spent $100,000 on doing a live telephone interview, random digit dialing sample, and somebody else may have spent $5,000 on an IVR?
That's right.
And what do you do with that?
Well, this is a question that comes up often, and it's a very legitimate one. Let me tell you this. When I have nightmares about what I do, the nightmare scenario of what I do is not when the polls are wrong. If the polls are wrong, it's not my fault. My nightmare scenario is the polls are correct, but I am wrong. That's the one that gives me sweats at night. And so I try to, I know every polling firm, even the best one, will sometimes miss. It's the nature of statistics. But I heavily rely on their current record. And so I look at their past record. And so a polling firm that has a bad 5 or 6 years, yes, I will weight in less in the projection. And let's say for now, the pollster right now that has the most accurate numbers in the past elections, it's Léger. Léger has been really precise in the last election. However, in the 2018 Quebec election, well, Léger did miss the mark. And so we have to be very careful. It happens sometimes even to the best pollsters. So I will look at the sample size. I will look at the history of the pollster. Right now, if a poll told me that the NDP was at 45%, I would probably say, yeah, okay, that's garbage. But I try to not judge, put my own opinion on this. And I try to have always numbers to justify my calculations.
Right. And do you have access to the raw data? Because, so much of what's interesting about polls is not just the top line number, but the breakdowns by demography or by geography. And are you able to do that as well?
Oftentimes, yes. Pollsters are supposed to publish at least some tables. They are supposed to. They don't always do it. I have a really good relationship with many pollsters across the country, so I can either email them or call them up and say, could I have additional numbers? And most of them have been really compliant to this. And again, we have a good relationship. So I've asked in the past for additional numbers. And if sometimes I see something that feels wrong or that looks wrong, I don't hesitate to ask questions. I don't want to be perceived as the police of polls, but when I ask questions and they don't answer, I will not give much weight to their polls.
Right. Okay. So I want to talk to you about politics.
Absolutely.
But I want to take just a slight detour, if I could, and that is McLean's magazine.
Yeah.
You were a contributor to McLean's magazine, and they used to promote you pretty heavily. You are no longer there, is my understanding.
That is correct. I was
just wondering, if you could provide us with a little insight as to what kind of magazine that is becoming. It seems to me that all their senior political writers have left.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it is anymore.
I do not either. I will say this. I respect the fact that they want to change direction. When St. Joseph Communications bought McLean's out of Rogers, because of course Rogers wanted to sell all their magazines, they gave it, I think, about 2 years to see where it goes. And then this winter, it seemed to me, at least out of the blue, they decided to fire many of the editors, including the editor-in-chief. Replace them with people that were in the magazine industry, but not in the politics or in the political affair, at least, realm. And everybody left or was fired. I was only a freelancer, but I think I was. The editors over there told me that I was one of their most read freelancer, and I did have an opportunity to speak with a new editor-in-chief. I had a Zoom call with her, and she was very nice and very polite. But it was clear that it's a change of business model, basically. They do not want to cover politics anymore. And of course, I didn't have a spot in there. So I explored other opportunities, and I'm very happy now I'm writing for Politico. But McLean's magazine is changing. They will perhaps find an audience for what they're doing. But I guess they will lose a lot of their political coverage, and I don't want to be part of that.
Is it a national version of Toronto Life magazine?
That's fair. I don't really read Toronto Life. I know what it is, but fashion and decor.
I scan it to see if any of my friends are in it. It's one of those things. Yeah.
Yeah. I just think right now in a time that we need political journalism more than ever, it's a sad state of affairs that McLean would decide to do this. But it's a business model. They figured they could make more money, talk about real estate than talk about politics.
All right. So you and I we'll talk about politics. Let's do that.
All right, let's do it.
And by the way, congratulations for landing at Political, first class place. Good friend of the Herle Burly podcast.
Very thank you.
And so let's talk about the Liberals first. What is their position right now in public opinion terms?
When you look at individual polls, David, and I don't have to tell you this, you know this, but when you look at individual polls, of course, you will look at some noise. And sometimes we overanalyze individual polls. But if you look back at the big picture and look at polling in the last, let's say, 6 months, or at least since the convoy, when Mr. O'Toole decided to, well, he didn't decide, but when he was kicked out of the CPC, polls have been mostly constant. I mean, right now, the average that I have is 32% for the Liberals and 32% for the Conservatives, 20% for the NDP. This is the status quo from the last election. And again, individual polls will tell you a different story, but when you average those out over days and weeks, you see that the picture right now has not moved much. And for me, this is a very interesting question because the Conservative Party has gone through a massive enrollment of new members, a massive from coast to coast, with Jean Charest and Pierre Poilievre mostly doing the work, and of course Patrick Brown, who's out now. And yet their numbers, at least in polling, has not gone up significantly. So for me, that's interesting. As for the Liberals right now, they seem to have lost a few points in Ontario, but it's still modest. They had 39%, I believe, in the last election. Right now, they're averaging 35 or 36. So it's still very close to what it was. But if an election was held right now, we'd have a minority. I can't tell you which color. It would most likely be the Liberals, but perhaps the Liberal plus NDP would not reach the 170 threshold. So all this talk of a fall snap election for me is a bit silly, to be honest, because I don't see who would gain from that. It would be a broken parliament. Okay.
This is a question that I ask just for you to illustrate, but people who listen to this pod from Western Canada and other places might think this is a legitimate question altogether, and that's who votes Liberal?
That's the thing. That's I think the strength of the Liberals, because they are relatively strong in every age group, among men, among women, among the poorer class, among the more comfortable class. When you look at the numbers, let's say per age group, the Conservatives are stronger with older people, and the NDP is stronger with younger people. And yet the Liberals usually is a very close to a straight line across all ages. So that's the strength of the Liberal Party, that they can pull votes from all sorts of demographics. So I can't really tell you this. The average Liberal voter, of course, would be in central Canada or around Vancouver or Winnipeg, of course. It would generally be in a city or in a suburb. And that's about it. It's not a very defined class, I would say. I did something on my website that was really interesting after the last election. I ranked all 338 ridings according to population density. So you take the population of the riding divided by the area of land mass, excluding, of course, water. And in the top 70, the 70 densest riding, the Conservative have one, and it's the 70th. It's Calgary Centre. Right. And the 69 other are either NDP or Liberal, and I think there's two block in there. So mostly it's urban people that vote for the Liberals in Canada.
Interesting. Okay. So are we in a world now where they should be content with 32% of the vote? Or is it not possible for people to still get 38 to 40% of the vote? What do you think about that?
It's a very good question. And if somebody had the answer, of course, the Conservative and the Liberal would jump on the answer. I think we live in a fractured electorate. The voting system right now does not really represent the numbers that we have voting wise. So to have, let's say, 36 or 37 or 38%, you would need a coalition of voters to being really inspired, like the way Trudeau did in 2015. It was a change election where he was able to take a chunk out of Tom Mulcair's NDP and also a chunk of progressive voters throughout Canada. Or if you go back to 2011, Mr. Harper, 39% of the vote, he was able to benefit from a crumbling Bloc and a crumbling Liberal Party. So you need a perfect storm to reach the 35 to 40%, I think, right now. And I do not see it on a close horizon unless Mr. Poilievre really surprises us and finds a way to keep the middle ground of the party with him once he wins. But we live in a different environment right now. There are 6 parties that had 5% or more of the popular vote, including, of course, the PPC. I think their vote share was 4.99. It's really hard to get to that 35 to 40%. You need to coalesce people around a cause. And right now, there is none. There is none. What is the project right now of any party? They say they want to unite, but how do you do that?
Right.
It's really hard in this day and age.
When there's something that impacts Canadians economically, socially, environmentally, frankly, in just about every aspect of our lives, you tend to want to come back to that subject again and again. So yes, Herle Burly-ites, we are embarking on a multi-week discussion of the importance of spectrum and spectrum policy in this country on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. And even as this is a TELUS message, it's with the backdrop that millions of Canadians have, in the last 2 weeks, had a deeply felt reminder of just how critical it is to have best policy in the digital space. Let's take a step back for a second. We've talked before here about how spectrum are the radio frequencies upon which wireless data travels. Spectrum is what makes your smart devices, well, smart. And it's fundamental to how all of us thrive in urban centers and rural and Indigenous communities all across the country. So, fair warning. In the coming weeks, we're going to take a deep dive into how the entire spectrum ecosystem works in Canada. In doing that, we'll bring it all down to a micro level and tell some compelling stories about how these invisible waves can, with excellent policy, have even greater effect on our lives economically, socially, and environmentally. We'll also bring it back up to a macro perspective and look at what our international competitors are doing with their spectrum policy, so we can compare some best practices in other countries. The digital landscape is an ever-evolving picture, Herle Burly-ites. What went yesterday doesn't necessarily have a bearing on what's going to bring the greatest benefit to Canadians from here on out. And that, in a nutshell, is why this is such an important story to tell. Learning and innovation in technology and policy can bring change for the better. Chapter 2 comes next week. What exactly do you think has changed? Let's just take 2004, for example. It's a campaign I know well. We got 37% of the vote, and that was enough only for a minority. And you know, not a stronger minority than Mr. Trudeau's winning with 32% of the vote. So is it the existence of the PPC that's changed? Because the Greens existed back then, the Bloc were stronger back then.
I would say the NDP changes a lot of things because the NDP might not get a greater vote share. They had, I think it was 18% last election, but they are really hard to dislodge once they get into a riding. They have many strong, many safe ridings, which I don't think was the case in the early 2000s. And so, you know, the NDP won 25 seats. You know, back then it was more than 12. And so there's a difference here. And the PPC, well, they were strong where the Conservatives were already strong. So, I mean, the exercise that many on the internet did after the election was to add up the PPC vote and the CPC vote. And you see that, yeah, the CPC would win a handful more seats if it wasn't for this disconnect. But right now, with the polarization that we're seeing, I'm not sure that many PPC voters would actually jump on the CPC train in an election. I mean, Pierre Poilievre is trying really hard to woo those voters towards his party. Will it work? I'm not sure. These are anti-establishment voters, and the CPC is very well part of the establishment. So we have a fractured electorate right now. I think it's going to be harder and harder in the future. I mean, you could get an election where nobody gets 3%. I mean, if you look at the Abacus poll that was released yesterday, it was very interesting. They explored, the hypothetical, what if Mr. Poilievre wins? What if Mr. Charest wins? And with Charest as CPC leader, the Liberals are at 28, meaning that Charest would eat up a chunk of Liberal voters. The Conservatives would be at 25, the NDP at 21, and the PPC at 11%. So you would have a fracture on the right. This perhaps is what awaits us in a few years, where a party cannot even get to 30% nationally.
Wow. Well, we're going to have to think about our electoral system at that point. I've been a big fan.
Well,
I've been a big fan of. I've been a big fan of first past the post because I like majority governments. But if you've got a majority government and it's in the 30% range,
it's harder to defend.
It's much harder to defend.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of talk in circles about the efficiency of the Liberal vote relative to the other parties. What does that mean? How do they win so many seats with so few votes?
Well, they do have a better get out the vote machine. They realized that, some time ago, the Liberals regularly got 20%, 25% in Saskatchewan and in rural Manitoba. Now they don't get that. They get 10%, but there's no difference there. They learn where to campaign to win seats. You realize that it doesn't matter if you get 25% in rural Saskatchewan, you can get 10 or 9 or 8. It doesn't matter because you will lose those seats. And so when you look at the electoral system that we have, many people would like to change it. But to change it, you first have to beat the systems. And the Liberals have the perfect formula. They know where to campaign and where to put their limited resources. And I think the CAQ in Quebec is the same thing. They have the best get out the vote machine. They know where to target those voters in which riding. And if the system changed overnight, they would have to adjust, and it could take a few cycles for that to happen. So then again, I talk about the population density indicator. It's much easier to campaign in cities and in suburbs than it is to campaign in the very large, very vast rural areas that we have here in Canada. And so the Liberals have a technical advantage on this point.
Right. So when you have a vote that's highly efficient, there must be a tipping point where it works in reverse.
Oh, absolutely.
So you talked about them being down 5 points from the election in Ontario.
Yeah.
So in 2004, we won 75 seats roughly in Ontario, and then we got 5% fewer votes in Ontario in the next election, and that cost us 20 ridings. So what is the point at which the Liberals start to really lose a lot of seats?
If the Liberals and the Conservatives are tied in Ontario, you would see the Liberal advantage in seats go down to maybe a 10 or 15 seats instead of the 40-ish that it is right now. And so it doesn't take much. I mean, especially you look at the recipe of Doug Ford in the Ontario election that they held in June, those 905 seats, those outer Toronto seats, the southwestern Ontario seats. I mean, the margins are very tight for the Liberals. If they lose 2 or 3 points in Ontario, you have 20 to 25 seats that could flip. And the same is true in some parts in Quebec. The outside of Montreal, the Liberals did okay in Quebec. However, take 2-3 points away and give that to the Bloc Québécois or the Conservative, and suddenly it's a different story. And obviously, I don't need to tell you this, but without a strong presence in Quebec, the Liberals do not win an election. So they need the Bloc Québécois to be there to stop the Conservative, but not too strong so that they can take La Mauricie or Gaspésie or the Eastern Township, for instance.
Now you're just picking at a scab, Philippe.
Well, the Bloc Québécois, I mean, let's remember...
The Bloc Québécois ruined my life. They cost me everything, those bastards.
They haven't won the most votes in Quebec since I was in my 20s. So it's been a while, but yeah, 2004, 2006, the Bloc Québécois, those were the good years for them.
Right. Do you think the government's well positioned? Like right now, we're moving into what I would consider to be a political crisis around cost of living inflation, rising interest rates. Do you think the government's well positioned to weather that crisis, or is this the last straw?
Right now, I think some liberal strategists must be thanking the good Lord that they did go into an election last year, because otherwise this government would already be tired. It looks tired, but we would really talk about a possible election this fall or maybe early this spring in the budget. But 2025 is a long time away, and they have an arrangement with the NDP. Let's see who breaks that arrangement first. But inflation is high, the cost of living is high, yet everything seems to be going wrong, yet the Liberals and the Conservatives are tied right now. So the government satisfaction will obviously go down. This is the natural direction. I mean, you're never as popular as the day you get elected. That's the natural way it goes with numbers. But 2025 is a long time away. And so, if the Liberals and the NDP weather that storm, in 2025, you could have a possibility for a re-election for the Liberals. I'm not sure if Trudeau's going to do it. I'm not going to speculate on this because I focus on the numbers. But Trudeau guaranteed himself a decade in power, just about as long as Mr. Harper. So he could go either way at this point. But the government is stable right now. If the NDP pulls the plug, the progressive voters across this country will be very angry at them. And Jack Meatsy knows that. So we have a coalition right now. Some people don't like it. It's not unanimous, obviously, but I think they can cruise to 2025 or 24, and it should be okay.
So there has been the odd poll that has tested possible replacements for Mr. Trudeau.
Yes.
Do you see a compelling replacement for him?
No, I do not. Obviously, this is highly unfair because people like, for instance, the obvious one is Ms. Freeland. She's obviously qualified, but is she able to run a campaign against Pierre Poilievre effectively? I think it would be really harder. Incumbency really counts in those matters. It can count for many points in an election when people, they go with the devil. If you go into an election and you don't have that person, it could be really hard. But I mean, obviously, she's qualified. I'm not certain.
That's not what it's about, though. That's not what it's about.
Not. It really isn't. It really isn't.
So it sort of feels like everything is falling apart, doesn't it? Labor and material shortages are wrecking our whole idea of normal. Airports are understaffed and clogged. The government has just ordered mobile chairs so people in line at passport offices can sit. Hospitals are understaffed and jammed. International supply lines are stretched and sclerotic. And thanks to Russian aggression, the world's food supply is severely disrupted. Well, our sponsor, CN, is doing its bit for the normal we all want to see return. The railway is now current on its grain shipments and has been since spring. That's industry talk for on schedule, no backlogs. And to ensure cargo keeps moving smoothly as we head into fall and winter, CN is spending some serious money. In Alberta, $365 million. That means installing tens of thousands of new railway ties and miles of new track, replacing 56 road crossings, and upgrading bridges, culverts, signal systems, and other infrastructure that ensures trains run on time. In Manitoba, the same sort of work to the tune of $160 million. In Saskatchewan, $185 million. CN will be replacing 151,000 railroad ties in my home province, incidentally. That's a whole lot of logs. And in BC, $390 million. Same deal. Further, CN is extending sidings between Winnipeg and Edmonton, starting similar projects at the ports of Prince Rupert and Vancouver, and double-tracking key sections of its western network. In plain English, that means giving one train a place to park and make way for a train coming in the opposite direction. In even plainer English, CN is making maximum effort to ensure cargo moves safely and on schedule. Obviously, weather is a big factor, and last year was brutal. But CN is determined that those things within its control are copacetic. That's a promise. I would start from the assumption that you have to, somebody who wants to be leader of the Liberal Party has to be able to win 35 to 40 seats in Quebec.
Yes.
Is there anybody out there that can do that besides Mr. Trudeau?
No, there isn't. there is I could be corrected, but at the moment I don't see any. I mean, Monsieur Champagne is a very interesting fella, but he's still low profile. He's been traveling a lot, and I don't think we see a lot of him. I do not see any top figures. I mean, this is an advantage for Mr. Trudeau, because 20 years ago, and 20 years ago, there were Chrétien liberals and Martin liberals, and they were fighting all the time. And before that, it was Turner liberals and Trudeau liberals. Right now, there are only Trudeau liberals. The party is not divided. It will not last forever, obviously, but the party is not divided. And if they look at the numbers, yes, inflation is high and discontent is high in this country, but the Liberals would be very competitive if an election was held this fall. So is it really that bad if the numbers haven't moved? If there has been the convoy in Ottawa and the crazy inflation that we have seen in 4 decades, and yet the Liberals are tied. So they have to be able to relativiser, as we say in French. It's not all bad on the political front when you look at the numbers.
But your message to Liberals would be you likely have right now the most effective leader you could have.
Yes, absolutely. Some would say it's not saying much because the aura around Mr. Trudeau, of course, has evaporated. I think it was gone after the SNC-Lavalin affair happened. And after that, he won 2 elections. So even in the bad times, Mr. Trudeau was able to come back. I mean, I have to say in the last election, in the early September, when the numbers showed that Mr. O'Toole was leading in Ontario and nationally, I really thought he was done. And then the debates happened. And then the last bit of the campaign, when PPC supporters mostly threw rocks at him, Mr. Trudeau suddenly looked like the reasonable one. And he carried the party on his shoulders and he won again. So he won more seats, actually, than in 2019. So unless you find a suitable replacement, you actually would want Trudeau to come back.
Right. Do you think, tell this to my English viewers. Listeners, viewers, whatever, yes. They could be on YouTube. Can an English Canadian leader be competitive in Quebec?
Precedent says no, but sometimes we can have an exception. Jack Layton did really well, but he did campaign really hard in Quebec, and is French. We noticed that he went on the popular talk show Tout le monde en parle, I think 4 times. And every time he went there, we noticed that his French was getting better. And he was even adding a little Quebecois accent to his French. But when you look at precedent, when was the last Anglophone to do well in Quebec? Stephen Baker, a little bit. But that's 6 there. They go. That's 60 years ago. I just don't think it can happen unless you have really great French with barely an accent. Otherwise, the Bloc Québécois will crush you in a debate. That's the thing. I mean, it's unfair for many English Canadians, but there's 78 seats to be won in Quebec. The Liberals need those seats. The Conservatives would like those seats. They don't need them, but they would like them. And if you have someone who has lukewarm French at best, you just can't win. The same way Stéphane Dion could win in English Canada. I mean, his English was terrible. It was worse than mine. Yeah.
Was not his only problem.
That's true.
Was not his only problem. But,
that's true.
But you're narrowing this down to language. And I'd like to just drill a little deeper.
Sure.
Is it about speaking French well, or is it about being from Quebec? Because, I bet you Chrystia Freeland has terrific Parisian French. But is that the answer?
I would love to see numbers on this. We haven't seen numbers on this in a while. But for instance, if I take Monsieur Leblanc from New Brunswick, would he be able to, to pass well in Quebec? I think the answer is yes. Madame Freeland speaks good French, but as you said, Parisian French is just good enough. Mr. Harper did have a reasonable score in Quebec in his first election because Quebecers heard his French on the Radio-Canada debate and sounded, okay, that's not bad actually. So it's not only down to language. You need content and you need le contenant et le contenu. And if you can't get the contenu, you need the contenant. If at the starting line your French is murky, Mr. Andrew Scheer in the first 5 minutes of that TVA debate lost it. He was surrounded on abortion. And it was over. It was over. And it wasn't even about the abortion. He could not explain his position currently in French, and the debate was over in the first 5 minutes.
All right, let's get to Poilievre here.
Yeah.
What kind of voter coalition is he putting together from what you can tell in the data?
His French is great, by the way. I mean, I don't know if you heard him speak French. He was with Patrice Roy a few months ago speaking Radio-Canada. His French is great.
The only test I have for people's French, Philippe, is that if I can understand it, it's bad. So, like, I always understood everything Ed Broadbent said in French, and I knew that French people did not think that Ed Broadbent was speaking French. So,
fair point.
So what kind of voters is Poilievre putting together?
Well, okay. Poilievre is trying to win over the PPC voters. He will not say that explicitly, but supporting the convoy and making these declarations about the Bank of Canada. This is the typical populist playbook that we have seen in other countries. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. What Poilievre has to hope for, if he does win, because it looks like he's going to win, is that he doesn't completely discuss the center of his party. I mean, a lot of people would vote for Jean Charest as a conservative leader, but then again, you don't please the base. You don't please the members of the party. Poilievre has to hope that many conservative voters in this country, when the election approaches, they will be able to hold their nose and still vote conservative just to house Mr. Trudeau. This is what he has to hope for. I think he would have a decent chance to win, to be honest. Some people, I know there's a lot of disagreement among pundits on this, but the numbers show that he's still being very competitive, and he would not sink the conservatives like some progressive commentators have said that, he's too far to the right, they will never win with him. I do not see that in the numbers. I see that the conservatives would remain competitive regardless of who becomes leader, to be honest. Regardless. Mr. O'Toole was not a great leader during the campaign. He still got 34% of the vote. We have to, let's remember that. Pierre Poilievre could absolutely win, especially if he goes back to win that few points from the PPC and holds the center.
So I have this theory.
Let's hear it.
Tell me if I'm full of shit, right? So,
I can swear here. That's true.
Yeah, that's right. I say Poilievre looks at the situation, and he says, O'Toole and Scheer got 32% of the vote. So a rock can get 32% of the vote, leading the Conservatives. So I can count on 30 to 32%. Just, it's in the bank. It's not going anywhere, right? So if I could spend my time arguing with the Liberals over the 7% of the current electorate that is undecided between me and the Liberals, and try to contort myself into a climate plan that they might like, and try to contort myself into an income support plan they might like, all that kind of stuff. Or I can just ignore those people and let them vote Liberal. Because 40 to 45% of Canadians are not voting. And if I can get 5% of that to come out, I swamp those other people anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So if I can motivate new voters and add them to the 30 to 35% that the Conservatives plus PPC gives me, that's my path, right?
Yeah. Listen, it's a reasonable path, but it's very risky to count on non-voters to vote for you, because non-voters usually don't vote for a reason. We have studies on this. People who, when they reach 18 years old, do not get to vote. They need a really good reason to vote, and they need to be motivated. They need to be driven, and so that's a very risky proposition. It could work. However, if you're going by this, you're still not winning most urban voters, and that means that the Conservatives could very well win the popular vote, not by a point, but by 3 or 4 points and still come up short in the seat count. Or they could win a very short minority because the wear and tear of time will have hurt the Liberals after a decade in power. But who's going to team up with the CPC? Who's going to team up in Parliament? Some would say we said the same thing with Stephen Harper 15 years ago, and that's fair.
Leighton put him into office. Yeah,
absolutely, a few times. Yes, that's true. But Poilievre is acting at least far more toxic than what the Harper did 15 years ago. So it's a recipe that could work. It's also very risky.
Do you think he's going to be, you alluded to this earlier, do you think he's going to be as easy for the Liberals to attack as progressive Twitter thinks he will be? Progressive Twitter is salivating for the attack ads on cryptocurrency and Bank of Canada and walking with James Topp and all these kinds of things. Is that all going to work against him?
It will work against those who are already convinced. And perhaps the Liberals' plan will be also to count on non-voters to let's stop Poilievre. But I mean, at some point, the strategy of playing the strawman argument against the evil conservatives will not work. I mean, it's worked in the past. I know it's worked once against Mr. Harper in a certain year. I think it was 2004. Yes, it did. But it can work, but it grows old. And I hope that's not the Liberal strategy because they're facing defeat otherwise. But those attack ads will be there nonetheless. But you will have to have a plan because right now the pandemic is knocking on wood, is so slowly ending. It's still there, but we're not in the deepest part or the worst part of it. Monsieur Trudeau has to show why he wants to be prime minister because this third term so far has been quite underwhelming. Why does he want a fourth term? If it's only to keep conservatives out of power, I fear that will not be enough.
When a government's been in power for 4 years in an election, the onus is on the opposition to explain why that government should be defeated. When a government's been in power for 10 years and there's an election, the onus is on the government to explain why it should be reelected.
Absolutely. It's a good rule of thumb. I mean, in my lifetime, the longest government we had was the Chrétien Martin government, and you had two conservative parties for most of that. At some point, every government gets taken down because people get tired of you. It's good for democracy. It should happen. But then again, I'm really, if Poilievre loses this, there's a small, narrow path for Jean Charest in points. I think that could also be very interesting because he will not have the support of caucus. He will not have the support of most members. But when you break down by region, there's a small possibility that Jean Charest could win on points. And I really wonder in that. I would love to see a alternative reality where that happens and what happens if he wins. Jean Charest is a pure political talent. He has, of course, his detractors and his enemies in Quebec because he has baggage. But it would be fascinating to see Mr. Charest face up against Mr. Trudeau. But I guess we probably will never see it.
I can't believe that. I just can't believe that. I'll bet you $50. I mean, I can't believe that. And I'll take all kinds of odds, any kind of odds you want. I mean, Poilievre surely had more support in the existing membership before any new members were sold than Charest did. Yep. He outsold Charest at a minimum 3-1 and maybe more. And Patrick Brown's people aren't going to show.
That's true. That's a big blow. That's a big blow for Jean Charest. I'm sure it was part of his strategy. But
he needed Brown's voters to get over the top for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah. I did say a very narrow. I play it on. I mean, if you give me a 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 odds, I'll take that $50 bet. But 20 to 1, I won't take it. So
there you go. Well, I'm not rich enough to bet anything at 1,000 to 1. And we'll be back after a word from our sponsor, Google.
What's happening with the rental market?
What summer festivals are on now?
What are the best road trips this summer?
Google helps you find the news that matters most to you. Whether you're looking for news from international publications or your local paper, we help you find a variety of reliable sources. Learn how Google supports news in Canada at g.co/news in Canada.
So last question about Poilievre. You said he speaks excellent French. That's the first step to being successful in Quebec. What about the rest of the package? How does this whole gatekeepers, anti-establishment, anti-elite, real conservatism message, how does that sell in progressive Quebec?
Well, here's the thing. Progressive Quebec, conservatives do not win in progressive Quebec. But there is such a thing as conservative.
I didn't mean a part of Quebec that was progressive. I mean, Quebec is supposed to be this progressive place. You go in there, sell hard conservative values.
Well, the CAQ is projected to crush the next election, well, of course, for different reasons. But and we have a new player in Quebec, in Éric Duhem, the Conservative Party of Quebec, who closely aligns with Poilievre at the federal level. So
and is second in the polls. Right?
In some polls he's been second. Of course, he's strong in Quebec City, where the CAQ is also very strong. So seat-wise, it might not be the harvest that he wishes, but he's between 15 and 20% in current polls, Éric Duhem. But, I'll say this, because I follow Quebec media closely. It's where I live. There's absolutely no talk whatsoever of the conservative race. We barely read about it sometimes in La Presse or Le Devoir. There's no noise whatsoever. The convoy did make a little bit of noise. The debate barely made the headlines. What I said about Poilievre saying toxic things to many Canadians, I think
they haven't heard
Quebecers, yeah, exactly. And Poilievre will go on Radio-Canada again with Patrice Roy and the other anchors over there and speak well French and talk about fiscal restraint and what conservatives, traditional conservatives, want to hear. And I think it could very well work. Now, the question is, the current Quebec caucus, the Alain Reyes and Gérard Deltel, for instance.
They hate him.
Well, I'm not going to say that, but they align with Charest, and they have shown that they dislike this new right-wing populism, conservatism. So what will they do? Will they just say, you know what, we'll fall in line because we want to win the election, or will they just bail? And that would be a bad news for Poilievre, because he currently has 10 conservative seats in Quebec. He needs at least this much if he wants to win. It would be nice to have 15. He could win Trois-Rivières, could win more in Quebec City, but it's been very low key here in Quebec. We don't talk about the conservative race much. We have an election this fall.
I presume that you know everybody by name who reads Le Devoir at this point.
Well, that's not very nice.
It's a sad reality of our existence. All right, let's move quickly to the NDP. So they signed this accord with the Liberals, and dental care hasn't happened yet. Jagmeet seems to think that the Liberals are doing a bad job of helping people through inflation, and says this on Twitter, and every time he does, people lash out at him angrily for his support of the government. So I can understand practical reasons why the NDP wanted this. They obviously couldn't afford an election financially in the short term, needed some breathing space that way. I think they can't intellectually have an election, because I think they need to figure out what their problem is from the last one, right, and intellectually try to figure out what they're doing wrong. So I think they wanted some time structurally, institutionally. But what is it doing to their standing in public opinion that they've basically disappeared as an effective critic of the government?
So far, nothing. They haven't gained any points, or I have them at an average of 20, but they always go up between cycles, 20%. The NDP is stuck in this situation, whereas the little brother in the coalition, they probably will not get any congratulations if the government manages to do something right. But they will be remembered as the one who propped up Justin Trudeau when everything goes wrong. It was a really risky proposition. Of course, the NDP I will not try to speculate on why they did this deal, but it was also good for them to have a 3-year window, say, okay, let's take a breather and hope for the best in 2025. Many NDP voters, again, will stick to their guns because they have nowhere to go. They will not vote Liberal again, and they look to their left. The Green Party is not really in good shape right now. There's no Green Party right now, and so they have nowhere to go. I would also say this, though. The NDP has lost its killer instinct. They had some for a little while, but the party that did not give Thomas Mulcair a second chance will give Jagmeet Singh a third chance. And for me, that says a lot about what the NDP stands for. I mean, Tom Mulcair, all right, he did not have a great end of campaign, second half of campaign in 2015. But I remember thinking in 2019, wow, those blackface photos, had they come out in 2015, we're talking about Prime Minister Thomas Mulcair. Jagmeet Singh, in every poll that we see, is usually the most appreciated federal leader. His favorables are always higher than his unfavorable. But I think this is hiding part of the problem for the NDP. Jagmeet Singh is not seen as a threat to the status quo. He is not dangerous. So naturally, many Liberal voters would like him because he's just there and he doesn't bother them too much. If you're the NDP and you see a potentially weak Liberal candidate in 2025, do you want to go for the jugular? Do you want to go all in and say, this is our chance to have left-wing policies being proposed more so than when the alliance with the Liberals came up? So right now, they're like the other parties. They're at the same level as the 2021 election, and there doesn't seem to be many waves.
If you were them and you were going to go at the Liberals from the left, what's the Liberal soft spot on the left?
Well, I would go back to affordability. I would go back to the housing crisis. Again, I would go with the environment. I mean, the Liberals have never put a threshold that they didn't meet eventually with the environment. But we have to be careful. Those issues usually don't move many votes. The environment is always very popular, but it doesn't move votes. But it could move votes with a younger generation, let's say in 10, 15 years, when the baby boomers finally die off and we have a new generation of voters. Perhaps the environment will be more important. But I go back again to the CEQ in Quebec. The CEQ is dominating among baby boomers. I mean, over 60% of support if you look at the polls. That's why in this election, in the Quebec election, we will talk about healthcare, not about education or the environment. I think the NDP has to hope that the environment and affordability can be a bigger issue for Canadians in 3 years.
If you envisioned a really bad Liberal campaign and a really, really good NDP campaign, how many Liberal votes are vulnerable to leaving to the NDP?
Well, 10 years ago, Ignatieff had 20%, I believe.
Roughly.
Yeah. So maybe not that low because, of course, Ignatieff, that was terrible. And you have to remember that Jagmeet Singh, most Quebecers will not vote for Jagmeet Singh. It's not happening. He's at 10% or 12% in the polls. There's a critical mass of Quebecers that will not vote for Jagmeet Singh no matter what. So who would take that slide? Who would take those votes from that the Liberals would lose? It would mostly be the Conservatives and maybe the Greens if they figure themselves out. But then again, Trudeau is really good in campaigns. You have to remember that. I mean, every time this guy has been underestimated, he has won. That's something that the conservative, as you said, liberal Twitter, conservative Twitter thinks that Trudeau is done in 2025. I don't think that. I think he's a better campaigner than a prime minister. So
he's built for campaigning. He's very good at it. Very good at it. Retail and wholesale. All right, let's move to Quebec provincially really quickly.
Yes.
Brigitte Legault was on this podcast a month or so ago. Super interesting conversation.
Oh, yeah, it was great.
From the CAC perspective. So let's start with this. If the CAC were to lose this election, who would they lose it to?
Well, I would preface this answer with we have never seen, I believe in Canada, we have never seen a party dominate so much in polls so close to the election and lose. So it's not impossible. It could happen, but we have no precedent. I remember, I'll tell you this quick story, if I may. I was at the Bell Center with a friend about 10 years ago, and the Rangers made it 5-0. And I turned to my friend and I said, "Do you want to get out of here?"
Greatest comeback of all time.
And he said,
Greatest comeback of all time.
I'm not done with my beer, and you know those are very expensive at the Bell Center. So he said, "Okay, if the Rangers make it 6-0, we'll leave." And the Habs won. But that happens once in a century. And I was at that game, of course. It was great. I didn't.
Congratulations. I remember that game. Yeah.
I was there till the end. So what I mean to say is that the CAQ will win the next election unless there's a once in a century screw up or from them and a better campaign from everybody. So who would they lose it to? The nightmare scenario for the CAQ would be the Liberals having a better campaign in 2018, where in many ridings they did not campaign. So do better in Montreal, in Laval, Eastern Townships, maybe make a pickup in the Outaouais. The Parti québécois would go back to have a campaign only on sovereignty, which would antagonize a majority of Quebecers. But right now, sovereignty is about 30% and the PQ is at 9%. So if they try to come to reinvite those sovereigntists, and Québec Solidaire has Gabriel Nadeau-Dubois.
Isn't Legault a sovereignist?
I think in his dreams he would love to, but he realized that he can't win. He can't win a referendum. And if he holds a referendum and he loses, then he's stuck and he can't do anything.
He's just doing it a different way, isn't he?
Well, step-by-step separatism. I'm not. I mean, I'm a numbers guy, so I will. I don't want to get in trouble here. I will step away from this. But you know, it's very popular in Quebec to have a face-off with the federal government, like in other provinces, say Alberta, for instance. It's always good to pick fight with Ottawa, especially in an election year. So Éric Duhaime would have a better campaign in Quebec City. So every party would have to overperform, and the CAQ would have to have a bad campaign like Pauline Marois in 2014. And then maybe the CAQ would have a minority. Maybe.
So I asked this flippantly earlier, but I want to ask it to you seriously now. The CAQ is a center-right party. They're not a movement conservative party, but they're definitely a center-right party. And then you have this in second place in some polls and selling more than 100,000 memberships in Quebec is this convoy-inspired conservative party. So why? I mean, Quebec has been known for its support of progressive political parties and for its rejection of conservative political parties, which is why Jean Charest has to go around apologizing for his government, right? Seriously, in the Conservative Party, because you can't defend that government in conservative circles outside of Quebec. So we've always thought of Quebec as this progressive place with progressive values on a whole range of issues, from childcare to the environment. Why are conservative political parties dominating Quebec right now?
Aging population. It's very simple. It's aging population. Quebec has a very low birth rate, and it has had a low birth rate for the past 50 years, and we have an aging population. So naturally, statistically at least, older people are tend to lean conservatives. They want to keep more of their money, and the social issues do not affect them that much. And I don't know. I'm not a sociologist, so I have to be careful here. But the CAQ, yes, is supposed to be a center-right party. However, since their first term began and the pandemic happened, they haven't done what traditional conservatives do. They didn't lower taxes. They didn't reduce the size of the Quebec state. They actually spent a lot. I mean, Doug Ford also did that. They spent a lot. And so there was a vulnerability on the right side for those former ADQ voters. Remember the ADQ and Mario Dumont? Those were real traditional conservatives. And those voters have felt left out. Because when the CAQ was founded, a few months after, it swallowed the ADQ, figuring, okay, we will replace you. But those ADQ voters still exist. And now many of them are going towards a very charismatic leader in Éric Duhaime. A very popular guy in Quebec City, a radio host, known for his sometimes shocking declaration, shock radio, as you would say.
Yeah.
So aging population and also lots of anger towards the government. This, I mean, we mentioned this in the first segment of the show. The second curfew in January 2022 was one too many. And it was during the first polls of January showed the PCQ of Éric Duhem going from 5 or 6% to 15%. And this affected CAQ voters that said enough is enough. We had the strongest sanitary measures in all of North America, and enough is enough. Rightly or wrongly, but that's what they thought. And that's why Legault probably will not implement new measures, even though perhaps the science would say you need to mask up when school begins in September.
Right. And what fundamentally has happened to kick the slats right out from under the Quebec Liberal Party? Like, I used to think they had the most solid base you could imagine, which was the Federalist core vote in Quebec. I mean, has the emergence of the CAQ and the breaking of that deadlock between the PQ and the Liberals, has that destroyed both of those other parties' reason for being, or what's happened?
The PQ and the Liberals needed each other. Basically, they needed to point the finger towards the other. It says, we will defend you against that. And so it's not a coincidence that both the PQ and the Liberals are sinking at the same rate. Right now, to be fair, though, the Liberals, they most likely will still become the official opposition. The Federalist core is still there. It's just that it's sort of satisfied with Mr. Legault. And when you break down the polls
but they won't win a Francophone riding. I've looked at the details. There's nobody French is voting Liberal, like less than 1 in 10 people. Right?
Yeah, it's 10 to 12% Francophones who would vote Liberal. That's extremely low considering that Philippe Couillard had won the Francophone vote in 2014. But two things here. The first thing is you have to remember that the Liberals ruled for almost 15 straight years. The wear and tear of time, the wear and tear of power does weigh on you. And so those defeats do happen. The Liberals, and this time around, they have to hope just that the storm passes and that there's still something after the storm, because it could be a very bad defeat. If all they have left is the West Island of Montreal, they could not come back from this. And the Parti Québécois is a bit the same thing. Right now, we project a lone seat for the Parti Québécois. A good campaign would be 4 or 5 seats. How do you get back from that? How do you get back up if you're reduced to maybe a single or maybe 2 seats in Quebec? So I think the Liberals long-term should be fine. But this election, they have to hope that they at least just get to the level, they win 15 to 20 seats and survive until the next cycle.
Excellent. Philippe, an hour just flies by. I could keep going. And maybe we should find a way to do that. But more importantly, where would my fine listeners and viewers find your work now? At Politico and where else?
In French, en français, l'actualité.com. I publish weekly columns during the campaign. It will be bi-weekly. And if you go on Twitter, 338 Canada, and if you go to 338canada.com, you will find all my stuff, every province except PEI. And the federal numbers that are updated weekly.
Excellent. Well, I read you all the time, and people should, because not only do you do a good job aggregating other polls, but you provide a ton of insight of your own along with it. And I enjoy our occasional sparring on social media.
I really appreciate that, David. Thank you very much. That's very nice of you.
Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for listening and watching. I'd like to thank Philippe for doing this, and I'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsor, CN, and our brand new sponsor, Google, for bringing this podcast to you this week. And we will see you next week with more Herle Burly. Take care.
Herle Burly.